This conversation today is focused on team diversity at the center of inclusion and empowerment as part of our broader series of conversations and webinars, and thanks to those who have joined us for those conversations to date. I'm so pleased to be joined with two phenomenal faculty members and partners to ExecOnline. Professor Martha Maznevski is Professor of Organizational Behavior and Faculty Director for Executive Education at Ivey Business School, Western University, joining us from Ontario, Canada. Professor Maznevski is an expert in global teams, global leadership, culture and identity, and empowering individual differences. Those of you may remember and recognize her from her very popular textbook, International Management Behavior, now in its 7th edition. So be sure to check that out if you haven't already seen it. And we have at ExecOnline been so pleased to work with Professor Maznevski for many years, as she is one of our lead faculty members in Leading and Managing Globally, which is a very popular program of ours.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Great.
And so pleased to welcome Professor Laura Morgan-Roberts. Dr. Laura Morgan-Roberts is Professor of Practice at the University of Virginia's Darden Business School. So joining us from just around the corner, I'm here in Washington, D.C., as is Professor Roberts. Her research and consulting focus on the science of maximizing human potential in diverse organizations and communities, so essential to the world we're in today. And she is co-author of a recent book, Race, Work, and Leadership, New Perspectives on the Black Experience, which was just recently published in 2019. Professor Roberts has served on the faculties of Harvard Business School, Georgetown University McDonough School of Business, and Antioch University Graduate School of Leadership and Change. And so now I'll turn it over to Professor Maznevski.
I'm excited about doing this together with Laura. Laura Morgan-Roberts and I met about 25 years ago when she was an undergraduate student at University of Virginia, and I was a new professor and doing my research on multicultural teams. And we had the opportunity to work together then, and I'm so pleased that we've been able to keep working together on similar things, but also very complementary. So it's really a pleasure for us to come together with this webinar, and thanks ExecOnline for giving us the opportunity to do that. So let's take a look at the first slide here. I'm really passionate about teams as a place for diversity and inclusion to show its potential. Now, at the same time, we know that diverse teams don't always perform as well as they could. So this is a stylized diagram just to show you the summary of all the results of the research over decades, but basically about teams. And also, just to be clear, we're looking at teams doing complex tasks. Okay, this is not teams doing very simple things that an individual could do by themselves, but we happen to have a team. Okay, so teams doing complex tasks like strategy development, execution and change, customer service, and so on. So diverse teams tend to perform either better or worse than homogeneous teams. Okay, and of course, there's no such thing as a completely homogeneous team, but more diverse teams tend to perform better or worse than more homogeneous teams. Okay, and so this gets a little bit tricky. So even though we know that there are some clear benefits to diversity, it turns out it's actually not automatic to get those benefits in teams. So some people say, well, is it worth the risk? And as you can see on the slide, we kind of have two answers to that. One is, well, you have diversity anyway, and if you're not using it and you're suppressing it, which is actually what happens most of the time, then you end up on the left-hand side with the poor performance. So if you have diversity anyway, which everyone does, then you should use it and get to the high performance. The other answer to that is actually we have some pretty good ideas, some knowledge about how to get to that right-hand side. What does it take to take a diverse team and perform exceptionally well with it? What we found in the research over the years is there are two paths to high performance in diverse teams. One path is about a set of principles and attitudes, and those can be summarized by inclusion. Acknowledging, respecting, valuing the whole person. So we need to have a team that's a safe space for people to be themselves. And then second, there's a set of behaviors, very clear communication and interaction behaviors that can be practiced and learned that we call mapping, bridging, and integrating. When we come to the workplace, when we come to a group, we're all very complex people and we bring a lot of different sources of identity. And to the extent that we can bring all of those identities to work and feel like they're valued and part of us, then we get positive energy. If we don't have that energy, it's hard for us to give everything to the task, and that's where we start to get some of the lower performance. Okay, and if we affirm each other's identities, so if we really see each other as whole people, not just as slices of people, if we affirm each other as whole people, then that empowers the energy and brings it. Okay, and we'll clearly be talking a lot more about that during this webinar, but basically the way you affirm identity is by caring for each other, by deeply listening, and really trying to understand each other, even when you cannot completely understand the other person, really doing your best to put yourself in their place. So that's affirming identity. The second part, so if we go to the next slide, is about the behaviors. Okay, and we found very early in our research that there are 3 basic sets of behaviors in teams that the more you engage these behaviors, the higher your performance, especially for diverse teams. Okay, and we call those behaviors mapping, bridging, and integrating. Let me start with integrating. So integrating is if you manage the differences, which means empowering participation, making sure that you've got everybody's view involved, that you anticipate conflicts and resolve them in integrative ways, so win-win conflict resolution, and if you combine and build on ideas rather than just voting or deciding to go with some kind of a majority or something. So what we see in a lot of group research is if you do those 3 things, you get high performance on complex tasks. What we found with diverse teams is that if you bridge, you will get integrating. So what's bridging? Bridging is communicating effectively across differences. It's got 3 parts. The first is engaging with motivation. So you actually have to want to understand the other person from their own point of view. Second, it's decentering without blame. So this is kind of what I said about inclusion, right? It's putting yourself, really trying to understand the other person. And if things go wrong, you don't blame anybody. Nobody's an idiot, nobody didn't try. You start from a position of, oh, we must have a different way of seeing this. Let's see if we can understand that. Okay, and then recentering is bringing things back together. And these are all clear skills that you can learn. Mapping is understanding the differences. And this is going way beyond the surface of, okay, introverts might not like to speak up in meetings and extroverts love to speak up in meetings, right? It's going way beyond that and understanding what those differences mean for how people can bring their strengths to a situation and what they bring and how we can empower that. So here's what we found in diverse teams with these behaviors. As I said, integrating leads to performance. If you get good integrating, you'll get good performance. But what we also found out is that bridging explains more than 2/3 of the variance in integrating. So in other words, if you get the bridging right, you almost automatically get integrating. If you don't get bridging right, you won't have any integrating. Okay, so bridging is really where you need to focus. And we've learned that especially in diverse teams, you must have good maps in order to bridge, which means you actually have to talk about the differences and really engage the conversations using the inclusive principles to try and understand each other and bring it in. So all of this is really hard work, but it's all really critical, and the payoff is amazing. So, what should we do with the diverse teams? If we can manage it this way and we can learn to do it and get a little bit better, then diverse teams really become kind of a laboratory for us growing empowerment and inclusion throughout the organization.
So Laura, I'll turn it to you on that.
When I think about these questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion through a race conscious lens, it invites me to sort of hone in on the dynamics of equity and what they mean in diverse team settings. So are we seeing a disproportionate set of experiences or feelings of being included or excluded by certain members of the team. Do some people feel they have more access to opportunities within the team, and others feel they have less access to opportunities within the team? Um, and do those disparities correlate in any way with race? And what I found in my research is, unfortunately, they often do. And so part of that work in mapping, bridging, and integrating is understanding some of those dynamics as well.
How do you think about the role of pipeline, the role of metrics at the team level in so much of the diversity management conversations?
Well, the one way that we think about metrics is through our employee engagement data or any kind of survey that you might be conducting to look across the board at the experiences of people within your organization. It's your follow-up analyses that cross-cuts those experiences based on different groups, such as gender, such as status, such as career stage and tenure, and also, by the way, race. This becomes an interesting conversation for us right now because so many organizations have not conducted these race breakdowns. And when they do, they don't make the data transparent or available. So we really kind of shy away from the conversations that would expose or reveal those kinds of inequities. But there are also metrics around representation, which are notable, and they tell an important story about power dynamics within organizations. So, for instance, if you look in a healthcare system, and we're talking about the percentage of people of color who work within that healthcare system, you would have to ask the question, where, at which levels? Because if we're looking at the lower levels in the organization with lower wage, higher risk of exposure, those are predominantly women of color in the United States. And if we look at the more senior levels, far less likely to be so. So, the numbers definitely tell a story. But that's just the first step, is to acknowledge whatever disparities might exist. The real work comes in terms of what you do around the information that you glean from the data. So I think we can lean too heavily on those numbers and metrics for measuring and for holding people accountable, and not do the deeper work of culture change within our teams. Whether or not people feel they can truly bring their whole selves to work, if they express their ideas um, and their identities freely in the context of the work, will let you know about the quality of engagement and interaction within the team. What we have found in our research, the experiences of underrepresented and marginalized groups, is that those individuals are statistically less likely to feel that they can be authentic at work. They're afraid to showcase any differences that they have because they feel they're so different just by virtue of being underrepresented or a member of a marginalized group, that they may be keeping their best ideas, their best suggestions, their best innovative suggestions to themselves. And that's a lose-lose for everyone.
In the business context, it is a matter of competitive advantage and performance that organizations which are able to do this right are going to win more frequently than organizations that are not doing this as effectively. And therefore, we are talking both at the human level as well as at the performance level. So I have a question here about, Laura, your question about the facade of conformity. Can you talk a little bit more about this, understanding how that manifests within teams and maybe what we can do about that?
What people do when they put on a facade of conformity is to mask some of their true beliefs, opinions, values, so that they can fit in or conform with what they think the most powerful people in their organization think, feel, and value. Okay. So that means when you're in a team meeting and you're talking about a new project or a proposal, and you see a gap or an error that, or misinterpretation of market trends, but you don't say anything about it. You keep it to yourself and you mumble and you're like, well, okay, we'll wait and see how this flies. I don't think this is going to fly, but that's on you all. Or, what many people I think would report is that they come in eager and they express a little more voice, but then they get shut down over time.
How can we encourage team leaders to bring their own authentic selves and have that be okay?
First, I'm going to go back to that curiosity. Be curious to ask the question and create space for the answer. And recognize actually that different people from different backgrounds will respond to curiosity in different ways. Being curious, wow, how did you think of that? Or where, what else is that related to? Those kinds of questions go a long way to modeling and being authentic yourself, because you're showing through your curiosity what your own personality and background is.
What if the team leader does not acknowledge really the difficulties with race? What if we are kind of, not in an open space with a leader who is leading an important team? How can an organization handle that? And then also on the individual side, similarly, how can we encourage one-on-one conversations to be psychologically safe, especially if you're not there, you're not able to witness that conversation? So how do we deal with some tough issues like those?
If you are someone who is more powerful because of your title, because of your social and political capital, and you have a wide sphere of influence within the organization, then when you observe these kinds of dynamics taking place, in where team leaders are, not creating these affirming identity contexts, then it's your responsibility to offer them some feedback, to welcome them into a conversation about this, speaking openly and transparently, and, give them performance feedback about that, just as you would give them performance feedback about many other things. So I suspect that the part of this conversation is, or the question is coming from a person who is either talking about their peers or trying to manage up and trying to figure out how to navigate these environments when you're the member of a team and your team leader is not sensitive to or invested in these kinds of affirming exchanges. What can you do then? And so that's very complex, right? So at the risk of oversimplifying, I'll just offer a couple of starting points. One is around self-awareness. So take some time to clarify your own sense of purpose and your identity story. If something is happening that is troubling you or triggering you in some way, take some time to unpack for yourself. Why is this so concerning for you? How do you see this as being problematic, not just for you, but for the team? How is the team missing out or losing out on some opportunities to learn from one another, to perform at a higher level, because this leader is not engaging in an affirming way? When you have more clarity about the origins of your concerns, then you're better equipped to have a conversation with someone else about those concerns. So you're not coming to the other person and saying, you. You're coming to the person and saying, this is my experience. This is why I'm experiencing it this way. I own these aspects of my experience. That's authenticity too. It's I'm owning my own experiences. And here's why I think they should be of concern to you, to the team, to the organization. The second is to seek for what I call your green lights. So even if it's not your immediate supervisor, is there someone else in the organization who has a sphere of influence or a base of power that has signaled to you that they are curious about you, about your story, about creating a more inclusive environment for people in the organization? Can you have a conversation with them? Can you get some coaching from them? Can they provide some coaching to this other person so that you don't have to take that on directly? I mean, there could be multiple angles that you would use, but it is really important to get some support internally in doing the work.
How should you address if a leader does not acknowledge their own unconscious bias? How can they effectively bridge when they don't realize that they have a gap?
And this is actually why I say you can't bridge without building maps. Without having maps, you can't build bridges, because the mapping includes understanding the differences and their implications, which means also understanding implicit bias or systems bias. So training around that, but there are different ways of doing the training, right? So training in a way that helps people understand where their bias came from, that it's in the system, that in a way that they've absorbed, and that they should be curious to learn from it. But it's very sensitive, and it needs to be managed very sensitively. But the worst thing is to ignore it. Right. And this is actually where I think, mapping means we talk about the differences and we have the tough conversations. We do it in a way that affirms identity, but we actually need to have those conversations, even if the trainer doesn't get a very high grade, because somebody didn't like it when they came to do it, right? It's often not popular to do this training, but we actually have to talk about the differences and their implications, including things like systemic bias. And people need to understand that they're part of, all of us are part of all of that, and accept that. So it's not easy, but it has to be part of the conversation.
When I think about bridging, it's like you've got to build a bridge between two separate realities, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't map out what the two realities are, then you don't understand what it is you're trying to bridge. Yeah.
If we've identified teams that are successful in this, that are doing a great job in the organization, how can organizations amplify those successful teams throughout the organization?
I like the idea of amplifying when it provides a specific example. Like, here is a moment, here is a project, here is a task that worked well according to these initiatives, and here's a process that they used in order to make it work well. Then people can kind of dissect it, learn from it, borrow from it as appropriate. It gets concerning when we take it too far. And I know that's, Martha, where you come, so I'll let you take that part.
Yeah, so I've seen it in a lot of company newsletters or websites or recruiting sites and things like that. And so I agree with Laura, but where I worry is that when you try to amplify, you actually end up making too stable and taking away all the dynamics. So a team becomes a team through their own journey, right? Each team is different, so each team needs to map, bridge, integrate its own way. Of course, there are some best practices about how to do that, and some tools that can help you on how to do that. But each team needs to do it themselves. And if other teams just kind of look at that one and try and copy it, they might not go through the tough discussions that it takes to get their own version, and B, the one that they're pointing to, they may just kind of stop and stop making progress, because it's like, oh, everybody's looking at us now, we need to keep it the same. So, and I've actually seen that happen, and then 2 years later, everybody says, oh, that they used to be good, but they're not anymore. So I agree. It's, to the extent that you can use that amplification to actually connect teams together to learn from each other in the way that Laura talked about, I love that, and it makes a big difference.
So one of the tools that I've helped to develop and utilize for team building is called the Reflected Best Self exercise. And it provides an opportunity for people to learn about their strengths and how they can actively engage their strengths to make important contributions in their workplace, but also beyond. So you collect what are called contribution stories from people in all realms of your life, past and present, professional, personal, and they give you 2 or 3 stories of times when they saw you at your best making a valuable contribution. And then through this collection of stories, you start to distill some themes about what you do and what you offer to a collective in a way that's special. When teams have those kinds of conversations and that shared understanding of people's strengths and contributions, they have stronger levels of engagement, they have lower levels of turnover, they have higher levels of performance. It also helps to dislodge some of the stereotypes that people often have about strengths and who might be good at what within within these team contexts. And so it's valuable for that too. And that's available through the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business.
We have another question about resources coming in, which is resources for building a D&I program if you don't have one.
So here are my my first steps. One is I think you need if you're starting it from scratch, you need to engage the services of a subject matter expert or a consultant so you can develop a customized pathway, because your system needs to have alignment with two things, and these are unique to your organization. The first is it needs to be aligned with your strategy, your reason for being. That may, even if you're a nonprofit, you still have a strategic mission in terms of how you're adding value into the sector in ways that some of your peer organizations may not be. So whatever you're doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion should be aligned in some way that supports that particular strategy. If not, it's always going to be considered an add-on, a nice to have, rather than a must have. And then the second is that your investment in diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially the equity piece, has to align with the core values of the firm. So if you're in a hyper or organization, whatever the organization is, if it's hyper competitive, it's going to be very hard to build an equitable, inclusive culture because the core values are simply not aligned with that. So you might put different guardrails in place. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a DEI initiative in place, but you should just be mindful of the fact that on the strategic alignment side, you might be stronger. On the values alignment side, it might be a little wobbly. But developing an overarching, holistic, systems-based plan, I think requires some coaching and advising so that you can get the data that you need and then develop the programs that will be most impactful for you.
If tensions are high in a group, what is your recommendation on how to address these issues?
It depends a lot, partly on how long it's been going on, and who is involved and what else is happening contextually. But certainly it should be addressed. And I would go back to some of the things that Laura said earlier about, on the one hand, first, understanding yourself, and how you're perceiving the situation and why. Not that it's on you, right? But looking at if you don't have a good understanding of your own situation in that terrible situation, then it's hard for you to seek help, right? And then seeking help, whether it's with a team member, a fellow team member, an ally outside, because it should be addressed. And if it's not addressed, this is, you saw that a lot of diverse teams perform badly, and this is why. This is exactly what blows up, and it leads to low performance, and it leads to the people who have the non-dominant perspectives either leaving mentally or leaving physically. So the organization should care, the team lead should care. And I hope one of the messages people keep hearing across all this is hard work, right? This is it's not easy, but it's worthwhile. So there's no easy solution to that difficult situation, but it's worth the effort, because where you can get to is really wonderful.
Thank you so much. We're all very committed to this work, and really appreciate the time that you spent. Thank you.